that have been translated into English, and there's a lot of them, he doesn't give a program for what China should do. Lu Xun is great at tearing down, but he wasn't sure how to build back up again. And that's a problem, right? You can't just say, let's get rid of old stuff. That old stuff served a function. If you get rid of the old government, you need a new government. If you get rid of the old ideology that ruled China, you need a new ideology. And Lu Xun was not producing that. To give you an example, though, of someone who did, I want to look at this guy, Chen Duxiu, right? Chen Duxiu. Tianyu, you study him in China?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. What's the most important thing about him, do you think?
I think for the
It's okay. But
revolution?
right?
No. Oh.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't put you on the spot like that. My apologies. It's okay. If you remember later, I'll come back to you with that question. So Chen Duxiu's an interesting guy. He's the one that starts New Youth. So he starts a journal, right? And it's today, like I think when people think about controversy or about the public sphere, about discussing things, we tend to think more about, like maybe something like a Twitter war where people will talk about debates on Twitter or something like that. In this time period, journals were extraordinarily important, right? They were often widespread. Oftentimes there weren't that many of them. So like everyone who was an intellectual would be reading the same journal, if that makes sense, right? So you would have a group of intellectuals. There's not that many different journals out there. They would all be reading the same one. And there were journals that would like open and close all the time. There was lots of failed journals. New Youth was a successful one. It was one that was widely read, one that was considered very important. And the guy who founded it, Chen Duxiu, who will later become a professor, I think, at Beijing University, and will help found the Communist Party. Right, this guy will eventually become a communist. He is a Francophile. If you're not familiar with that, what that term means is someone who loves the French and French culture and French ideas. Now, the key thing about this, during this time period, that's someone right on the other door, on the board on the other side. Wow, these walls are thin. During this time period, if you wanted to find radical ideology, you went to France. Right? The French were just on the forefront of radical political ideology. French socialists, French anarchists were some of the leaders in coming up with ideas that would challenge the status quo, which I think is kind of interesting. But that's what's key is that he's not, when he says, when I say he's a Francophile, he's not like into Charlemagne or the ancient or the Louis. He is interested in the radical ideas. And he read French and had been to France. So he's importing these radical ideas. And he argues, this makes sense since he's part of the May 4th movement, it's not just technology or politics that needs to change, we need to transform China completely. And so, like Lu Xun, he's an iconoclastic figure. He challenges Confucian virtues. He says they're terrible. He criticizes ideas of female chastity and say, why don't we apply this to men as well? Why is it that only women have to be chaste? He criticizes the Chinese family system. And he also makes some very interesting criticisms against language. And I want to give you an example. Like I said, Lu Xun and Chen Duxiu both kind of tear down things. But I want to give you one example of the way they were trying to construct, especially Chen Duxiu was trying to construct. Now, if I was to tell you, in the People's Republic of China, they use one type of Chinese, type of Chinese character, and in Taiwan, I think Hong Kong too, Korea and Japan, they use another kind of Chinese character. That's true, right? So there's what's called traditional Chinese and simplified Chinese. So as you can see here, this is the traditional one for to open, and they changed it to this. It's a lot simpler, right? This, by the way, is a gate. The two pieces on the side are a gate. That's why it means open, right? And you can see this one is fun. They made fun a lot easier. They made learning a lot easier, right? They simplified the characters. That's a lot of times when I talk about this change in language, there was a big argument about whether or not to do this. Right? But you can see it would make learning Chinese a bit easier, wouldn't it? But here's the other key thing I have to emphasize about language. Okay. If you can speak English, it's not that hard to learn to read English. Right? And the grammar is basically the same, isn't it? Like there's different, informal speech is of course different from writing. But for the most part, right, subject, verb, object, right, the grammar is the same. Sometimes we would correct vocabulary when we're writing, but for the most part, if you can speak English, writing English is not that different. It was completely different in China during this time period. Speaking Chinese and writing Chinese were almost completely different, with the exception of some of the modern novels. Basically, people, when they wrote like Confucius wrote. And they didn't really have a standardized grammar. But spoken Chinese had changed since the days of Confucius. So what this meant was, if you wanted to learn to read Chinese, it was like learning a completely other language. And I don't mean simply that you had to learn to read all these different characters. I mean that you actually had different grammar patterns. The grammar was completely different. And it was completely different from spoken Chinese. So this was an obstacle to literacy. It took a long time to study and learn Chinese because you weren't, in a sense, this sounds really weird, but you got to think about this. To learn to write Chinese was like learning a foreign language, even if you spoke Chinese. Right? Even if you spoke Chinese, learning to write Chinese, Hanmun, right? It's completely different. So people like Chen Tuxiu said, let's fix that. Let's reform written Chinese to make it more like how people actually speak Chinese. Right? Let's get rid of that. That's crazy. Let's get rid of it. Let's make written Chinese similar to spoken Chinese so it's easier to read. Let's change the characters so that it's easier for people to learn to read and write. That's the basic idea. And so that's an example of them not just engaging in destruction, but also construction. And notice the idea, we need to wake up the Chinese people. Right? That was Lu Xun saying, we need to wake up the Chinese people. How do you wake up the Chinese people? How does helping them, how does writing something for them help them if they can't read? Well, let's make it easier for them to learn to read. Let's make it easier for them to become educated. Right? Our culture needs to be changed to fix China. We need to educate people to do that. Let's make it easier to educate people. And that's the kind of reform that Chen Tuxiu was supporting. Right? And there were big debates about this. Because what it means now is that if you're Chinese, it kind of cuts you off in a sense from reading the old historical documents. I'm not sure if that's that big of a deal, but that's how it's understood by some people. And if you were to ask him, what will save China, he told you 2 people will save China, Mr. Democracy and Mr. Science. I thought it was interesting that he made them into people, in a sense. Right? He said, Mr. Democracy and Mr. Science, that will save China. Now, when you look at that, you may say, oh, he kind of wants to make China look like, say, the United States or Great Britain. Right? Similar to what Sun Yat-sen wanted to do. But that's not quite the way he saw things. He's going to use Mr. Democracy and Mr. Science in very different ways. And this can be confusing because people can use the same word and mean completely different things. But do you remember how we talked about the Boxer Rebellion? Right? How you had this rebellion, they killed, the Chinese Boxers killed foreign diplomats and Christians and missionaries and so forth. And then, the 8 powers came in and just utterly devastated them and they engaged in their own massacres. But because they won, they forced the Chinese to do things like this. The Chinese were forced to build a monument for a German diplomat who was killed, a man named von Kettler. And so the Chinese were forced to build a monument honoring him. And that's kind of an issue, right? That's kind of an issue. If you're Chinese, that's very frustrating. Right? We have to honor this guy who we consider part of the foreign imperialist who is oppressing us. So Chen Tuxiu wrote an article criticizing this movement, saying that this movement was wrong, saying that there were lots of problems with it. And this is what he says. There are at present 2 paths open to us. One is the path of light that leads toward republicanism, science, and atheism. The other is the path of darkness leading towards autocracy, superstition, and theism. If our people do not wish for a revival of the Boxers, if they are loath again to contemplate the erection of humiliating memorials like the von Kettler Monument, which of these paths, in the last analysis, shall we take? So notice he's done something a little bit different here. This is not Sun Yat-sen's understanding of reform. Remember, Sun Yat-sen was a Christian. Right? And there were Chinese who wanted to reconstruct China into a Christian republic that looked like the United States. Right? That was their basic goal. Right? They want to reconstruct this into a Christian republic that looks like the United States. Or that's what some Chinese want to do. Not Chen Tuxiu. And notice that he puts science against religion. Right? Religion is seen as bad. The Boxers were superstitious, he would say. One thing I didn't mention earlier was that the Boxers believed that by engaging in particular rituals, they could not be hurt by bullets. Right? The Boxers believed that if they engaged in particular rituals, bullets would not hurt them. And were shocked when sometimes bullets did hurt them. And so Kettler says, we need to get rid of those silly superstitious beliefs, and we don't want to trade, I'm sorry, Chen Duxu says that. We want to get rid of those silly superstitious beliefs, and we don't want to trade one superstition for another. We don't want to give up Chinese superstition to take on Christian superstition. We need something completely new and different. We need to organize our society along scientific lines. So you can see a change, increasing radicalization. Now, there's a lot of Chinese who disagree with this. Right? There's a lot of Chinese who disagree with this. But others would become even more radical and more organized. Right? Others will become even more radical and organized. I'm sorry. So I went to one of the new ideologies that's going to come in is communism. Right? Communism. This is about as radical as you can get. And the Chinese understanding of what it is to be modern is going to be very different. So you have this question I want to ask you. I'm going to play a clip for you. What is it and how it gets to China? Right? That's kind of what I'm going to be talking about. Right? That's what I'm going to be talking about. But I have a clip I want to use to review it. And then I'll go back over the details.
Consider, my dear viewers, a world without money, without class divisions, where everyone gives according to their abilities and takes according to their needs. Sounds pretty sweet, no? To German poet and philosopher Karl Marx, such a communist utopia was not only possible, it was inevitable, or what he called the march of history. Though deeply influenced by Hegel, who proposed that history develops through the abstract concept of world spirit, Marx believed that it is not conflict of ideas that propels history, but rather conflict arising out of our relation to material goods that will bring history to its end, specifically our working conditions. Marx calls this historical process dialectical materialism. Initially, humanity was concerned only with the most basic acts of our species, producing for personal survival. But as the population multiplied, economic systems were established to address the needs of all. And with economics, an individual's relationship to the products they create changes, for one is no longer producing for their own immediate needs. They are producing for others. Fast forward to the Industrial Revolution, where mankind created mechanisms to fulfill the needs of many with unprecedented efficiency. These mechanisms, or capital, are owned by individuals, leading to enormous concentrations of wealth. And for the tired worker who must operate these machines, there is no getting ahead. For in order for the capitalist to maximize profit, he must pay the workers little more than is necessary to survive. To Marx, this economic system of capitalism thrives on exploitation and creates widespread unhappiness through what he calls alienation. For starters, I am alienated from the fruits of my labor. If I create a turnip, it'll be sold to another. In exchange, I'll be paid a wage and become as much of a commodity as the thing I produce. Thus, I am removed from my work. I do not see myself in my labor. Capitalism also alienates us from each other. For the worker to produce efficiently, the capitalist tells them they're in constant competition for their job, thereby turning our fellow man into an adversary rather than an ally. Furthermore, capitalism alienates us from our very nature. Creating is a great source of satisfaction for our species. But because we are forced to make things that we have no personal investment in, our lives become a burden. As time goes on, and industrial powers become increasingly concentrated among a select elite, the gap between the working class and the capitalist will only become wider. To Marx, this gap will eventually become so pronounced that the workers, in their profound frustration, will rise up and overthrow the oppression of the few and usher in a new society. A society in which there is no private property, there are no class divisions, where people's labor is held for the common good, and where all work according to their ability. And that, my friends, is communism. Even today, Marxism is one of the most powerful ideologies in the world. And to some, The ushering in of the Marxist utopia still lies in the not-too-distant future.
As an aside, Super Mario Bros. 2 was the very first video game I ever beat. And I was disappointed because, of course, it turns out that it was all a dream. If you watch it, that's how it goes. So, we need now to talk about this guy, Karl Marx, and his ideas, right? To understand communism in China, the rise of communism, we need to understand the founder of communism. To understand his works today, I think, are required reading, of course, in Chinese classes, right? You have to read Marx, right? So when do you start reading him? Like in grade school or middle school? Or
in all graduates, undergraduates.
Undergrad, so in college you study Marx. I think it's a required class.
Yes.
Right? Yeah, so like it's a gen ed class that you have to study Marx. I'm probably going to talk about slightly different things. When I've talked to Chinese students before and they say, oh, we didn't really study that part, that's because I'm focusing on 19th century Marxism rather as a historical explanation as opposed to current day Marxism, which would be for China Marxist, Leninist, Maoist thought, I think. So it's a little bit different, so please bear with me. But right, this is when communism is going to start in China. And of course, communism will eventually be victorious in China. So it's very important to study Marx. So Marx is interesting because he was a historian, right? He understood himself to be a historian, the only optimistic historian, which is why I think he's completely wrong. Right? Historians, we tend to be kind of cynical and pessimistic. But in any case, Marx was optimistic. And he lived at a time when everything was about science, right? There were people who would say the only knowledge we can have that we can trust has to be scientific. Now, as a historian, I would say, well, you can't scientifically study history because we can't do experiments on history. It doesn't work that way. But in any case, Marx claimed to have studied history scientifically. Right? Marx claims that he is going to study history scientifically. So he's going to try and discover the scientific laws that govern history. Right? So from Marx's perspective, there were scientific laws that govern history. Which means once you understand the laws, you can predict what will happen. Right? Just like, you remember you did that experiment when you were kids, right? Where you put one plant in a closet, one plant under the sun, and you discovered the scientific law that, plants don't grow unless they have sunlight, right? You can predict then what will happen. Marx is arguing that if he can understand the scientific laws behind history, he can predict the future. And he thinks the future will be good. In particular, what he argued, though, is that human history is driven by the economy. Right? Human society passes through different economic stages. Right? Marx's understanding was that human history passes through different economic stages. Well, what makes one stage different from another? Class conflict. When class conflict changes, you enter into a new stage of human history. So you can kind of think about human beings are like walking up a staircase. And each step we take has a different kind of class conflict. So notice at the center of Marx's thought is this idea of conflict. Right? The center of Marx's thought is this idea of conflict. And I want to stress, he thought the economy essentially determined everything. So for example, remember I studied religion. And Marx would say, I'm wrong to study religion. Religion is merely the reflection of economic issues. So for example, if I was teaching the Reformation, and I do teach the Protestant Reformation, I would talk about these issues about different understandings of Christian doctrine. I would tell you some economic conflict, but I would argue principally about doctrine and what people were thinking. I'm talking about some politics too. And Marx would say, no. This may look like religion, and that may look like the conflict's about, but it's not about religion. And he would argue that what fundamentally drove the Protestant Reformation was economics. Right? Religion's merely what he would call a superstructure. It's not the foundation of change. So the economy determines everything. Each stage of history is marked by a different kind of class conflict. And in a sense, what determines the class conflict is the mode of production, how things are made, right? How things are made, and in particular, who owns what. And I'm oversimplifying things, but basically, there's two groups of people. There's the oppressor, and the oppressed. Right? In Marxism, there's two groups of people, essentially the oppressor and the oppressed. The oppressor owns the means of production. The oppressed does not. Right? The oppressor owns the means of production. The oppressed does not. So to give you an example of how this works, Marx argued that the first stage of human history was pure communism. I'm not going to talk too much about that, but his second human stage of history was slavery. in this second stage, and this would be like the ancient world. This would be like the Romans or the Greeks, who were slave-holding cultures. In this case, the oppressor class were slave holders, and the oppressed were the slaves. I'm oversimplifying things, but this is how he understood it, right? So you have slavery, right? In this case, the oppressor class are those who own the slaves. The oppressed are the slaves themselves. Eventually, this class conflict will lead to a new stage of history, feudalism. This would be roughly equivalent to the Middle Ages. Right? This would be like, knights in shining armor and lords and nobles and things like that. And in feudalism, what's important, the means of production, is land. Not people, it's land. And the oppressors are the ones who own the land, the kings, the aristocrats, the church. The oppressed are the peasants, the serfs. Then there's more conflict, and then eventually we end up in the capitalist stage, which is the stage Marx believed he was living in. In the capitalist stage, workers are the oppressed. The oppressors are the industrialists, the capitalists, who own the factories and the machines. Right? They're the ones that own the factories and the machines. So they are the oppressors. So it's very simple. And I want to stress, this is one thing that makes Marxism so attractive to people. On one side, it's fairly easy to kind of understand the basics. Right? I gave you, I think, a fairly decent analysis. I see people nodding their heads. I think they understand this. But you can go a lot deeper than this. So when you have a system of thought that is both that people can understand fairly quickly, but is also very, very deep, it's going to attract people. So that's the basic idea. Now, remember I said that Marx was hopeful, and you may say, what do you mean he's hopeful? He's talking about oppressors and oppressed people. He's hopeful because he believed the next stage would be communism. Right? So he thought the next stage would be communism. He says, I have identified the laws that govern human society, the laws that govern history. I can tell you what's happened in the past and why, and because of that, I can predict the future. And this is what the future is going to look like. This is what I would call the communist utopia. Right? This is what the future is going to look like. In the communist utopia, there's no private property. Right? There's no private property. Goods would be shared evenly. Now, I don't mean that people would share a toothbrush or something like that, or someone could just walk in and take your clothes. But the idea is everyone would get enough stuff. There wouldn't be people who don't have enough clothes. There wouldn't be people who would not have enough food. You would be allowed to have your own personal property just so you could live your life. But you wouldn't be allowed to have huge amounts of land and then other people not have any. Everyone would have enough of what they need. Right? Everyone would have enough of what they need. Why? Well, goods will be shared evenly. Marx pointed out, right? You kind of think about it this way. We think of unemployment as like a social problem. Marx said unemployment's not a social problem. It points to the fact that we are so efficient that we can make sure people have enough food to eat without anyone working, without everyone working. Right? He flips it on its head. We have unemployed people, but look at how much wealth our society is producing, even when not everyone is working. Right? Does that make sense? Like his critique? So his point was, it's no problem to make sure everyone has enough of what they need. We are so efficient at producing stuff. We have more than enough. We can produce stuff we have enough when not even everyone is working. So we just need to make sure things are shared evenly. Everyone have enough of what they need. Therefore, there will be no conflict. Right? Therefore, there will be no conflict. Right? Remember, Marx thinks that what Marx's history is class conflict between the oppressor and the oppressed. Well, if goods are shared evenly, the oppressors disappear, don't they? And then there's no oppressed people. Right? Then there's no oppressed people. If that happens, then there's no conflict. Right? Remember, he thinks all conflict is fundamentally caused by economic problems. We make sure everyone has enough stuff, no conflict. And remember, you may say, what about religion? Right? Remember, I would say religious differences helped drive the Reformation and the violence that came out of it. And he would say, no. Those were fundamentally caused by economic issues. They maybe look like religious issues, but if you look deeply enough, it's actually economic. Now, here's the other thing that's really cool about Marxism. No conflict. Not no conflict. We don't need a state. What do we need a government for? Think about what's one of the major things the government does is have courts that try to deal with conflict between people. What's another big thing the government does? It has an army. It has police. Well, we won't need any of those things because there's no more conflict. Yeah, Tyler?
There was this old show we used to watch, it was a cartoon, it's called the Smurfs.
Yeah.
Did that depict communism as well?
It's actually more, I think, what's called anarcho-syndicalism. But we always joked about that because, of course, what color did Papa Smurf wear?
I mean, they all look the same. Like,
Papa Smurf wore red,
yeah.
right? And it was this benevolent dictatorship. But so we all joked about it, and everyone was a worker. They had their place, except for Vanity. He was lazy. And Lazy Smurf, who was lazy. But in any case, that's why they would be more like anarcho-syndicalism. So you're raising a good point. I wish we could go more into detail there because anarchism is fascinating. But the idea then is, right, we don't need a state. There's no more conflict. States exist to deal with, problems. There's no more problems. Therefore, we have perfect freedom. Isn't this awesome? Just like, this is great. What more could you want than having enough stuff and the freedom to enjoy it? Right? That's essentially what communism promises. Everyone will have enough, and they will have the freedom to enjoy it. Yes, Dylan.
What about human nature? That's the big crux of
Well, they had a different understanding of human nature, right? About what made humans humans. This is like I said, my job here, I won't critique communism. I don't agree with this. I think, and for exactly the same reason you do, I don't think this works. But there you go. So how do we get there? Right? How do we get there? Well, the idea is that workers would be pushed so far by the capitalist search for profits they would rebel. Remember they talked about that in that video clip. Right? Eventually, we had this terrible capitalist system where the workers are put up against each other, they're competing with each other, and eventually they're going to be squeezed so much that they're going to overthrow the government. And you kind of think about it this way, right? It's not simply that capitalists are bad people. Let's say I'm a factory owner, right? I'm a factory owner and I pay my workers $5 an hour. But then the guy next door, who also runs a factory making the exact same product I do, he only pays his worker $4 an hour. What happens if I'm a nice guy and I keep paying my workers $5 an hour?
You go out of business.
I go out of business. So Marx is saying this whole system is rotten. Even if you're a nice person, because of your class identity, because of the system, you will do this. You will oppress people. And so there's always this downward pressure on the workers. Squeeze the workers, squeeze the workers, squeeze the workers. Right? Labor's a cost. And the less the workers are paid, and the more that they do for that lower pay, the more the capitalists win. And once one capitalist figures out a way to do it, all the others will have to do it. Or else they'll go out of business, and someone else will take their place. So eventually things are going to get so bad for the workers. I want to stress, when I say workers, he means factory workers. Don't think like agricultural workers. Marx compared peasants to a bag of potatoes. They just sit there and do nothing. Right? But I think he literally called them a bag. He said the peasants are a bag of potatoes. They do nothing. Or maybe he said bag of potatoes. I'm not sure which one. So here's the thing, right? This would naturally then happen in industrialized countries first. Right? This is going to happen in industrialized countries first. It's going to happen in Great Britain first. That's his prediction. Because it's the most industrialized country. Remember, he believes in economic stages. Right? You have to go through one stage to get to the next. It's going to be in the place where workers are squeezed the most. Now here's the other thing. This is going to be violent. This is going to be violent because the capitalists will never surrender without a fight. They will never give up their wealth without a fight. Every earlier one involved conflict. It involved fighting. Every other stage involved fighting. So this stage will too. Right? This stage will too. So this is going to be violent. The capitalists will never give up power. All means are acceptable for bringing about the revolution. Right? There is, in a sense, the ends justify the means. Values, virtues, from Marx's view, were created by the economy. So if I were to say, well, Marx, I think you're being dishonest, or I think this violence is wrong, he would say, those are bourgeoisie values. You should not adhere to them. What's important is the revolution. Your idea of justice is just determined by your economic class. It's unimportant. What's important is the revolution. Now, Marx is wrong about a lot of things. And even Marxists accept that he was wrong about a lot of things. Marx emphasized, I'm maybe wrong about some things, look at the data, and then change my ideas as you need to. Right? Marx was open to the idea he could be wrong. He said, this is science. As more data comes about, you may find that I'm wrong, you can change things. So if you talk to a communist, they'll say, yeah, Marx was wrong on some things. There's not a problem with that. So Marx is going to be wrong about a lot of things, right? For one thing, where was the first successful communist revolution? Russia, right? You all know. It's been a long day, I'm sorry. It's only 11. he's wrong about a lot of things, but one thing that Marx is really good at doing is organizing. And one thing, if you want to understand anything about communism, communists are great organizers. They're great organizers. And so even when Marx is wrong about some things, he will help start communist parties that are great at organizing people and mobilizing people for a revolution. And this is key, because as we look at China, the communists get beaten up all the time, and they keep coming back. And all that has to do with their organization. All that has to do with their organization. And I'm sorry, I missed one thing. Now here's kind of an ambiguity in communism, right? The enemies are primarily defined by class, not by any particular action. Right? You are an enemy, you're an oppressor based on your economic class, not necessarily anything you do, and anything you do that's bad, it's mostly your class, but it doesn't matter, in a sense, right? The class is the enemy. So when the Russians had their revolution, this is a French journal, but it's showing, the Russian communists executed not just the Tsar, but his entire family, including kids. And in the Russian Revolution, they hung rich peasants. They just executed all these, what they called rich peasants. The term is kulak, because they were class enemies. They didn't bother to see what any of them individually had done. It was enough that they were part of that class. So there's this kind of ambiguity. Can you actually overcome your class? Right? Can you overcome your class background? Right? So for example, do you remember Puyi? Right? The last Qing emperor? The Chinese communists did not execute him. They actually got a hold of Puyi. They didn't execute him, they reformed him. They didn't kill him. And I'm not trying to say, well, the Russians were this way and the Chinese were this way. I'm not trying to say that at all. What I'm trying to say is there's this ambiguity in communist doctrine. What do you do with class enemies? Do you reform them or do you execute them? Right? Violence is okay, but the question is, what do we do with these people? Do we reform them or do we get rid of them? And it's not so important what they did. What's important is who they are. Right? Because everything in a sense is determined by class. I hope that does that make sense? Any questions there? It's a different way of thinking, right? The focus is not on what you do, the focus is on your class background. So how does this all get to China? There were some problems with the May 4th movement, right? The May 4th movement was kind of an elitist movement. If you look at the issues that the May 4th movement focused on, it was mostly ones for intellectuals. Moreover, it focused a lot on individual rights. And one problem with that, of course, is that there's not that many intellectuals in China. There's not that many people who can even read. So the May 4th movement, and it's great at destroying and saying we should stop doing these things, these are bad, this traditional culture, but the May 4th movement is not good at figuring out what Chinese should do in a practical manner. People are great at thinking of these big, strong, big ideas. They're not good at implementing them. An example I like to give is anarchism. Anarchists are smart. When you think of anarchists, don't think of those people who show up at peaceful protests all dressed in black and they break things and mess up the whole point of the protest. Those aren't real anarchists. Real anarchists are really smart and have a very deep ideology. I'm not an anarchist, by the way. I'm a believer in liberal democracy. But anarchists had a very deep ideology, very, very smart. You could teach whole classes on anarchist thought. But they have a big problem, and I'm not joking, they're not well organized. That's always the joke, anarchists of the world unite. That's not what anarchists do. So that would be an example of an ideology that wasn't really going anywhere. They had neat ideas, but didn't really do anything. Then the Russian Revolution happens, 1917. So remember, the May 4th movement, you can argue, begins back in 1915. 1917, you have the Russian Revolution. And in this, you have a major revolution. Right? You have the overthrow of the czars who had ruled Russia for 300 years. And they looked a lot like the Qing Empire. Right? When you think about Russia and China, you can make a lot of interesting comparisons, right? They were both ruled by autocrats. The Tsar and the Qing emperors were very similar. Right? They're both ruled by autocrats. And they're both gigantic land empires. So when that happened, many Chinese people were interested in what was going on in Russia, because Russia was so similar. And Russia becomes really strong really quickly, right? Whereas in China, things really fell apart after they got rid of the Qing. That's not what happens in Russia. They've got a civil war, but very quickly they establish a pretty strong government that is going to start transforming Russia. And one thing that almost immediately that the Soviet Union does, and I tend to use, I'm from the Cold War era, I tend to use Russia and Soviet Union interchangeably, which I shouldn't do. But after Russia has its revolution, you have the Soviet Union is established, it is communist, and they repudiate the old unequal treaties. They say, we're going to get rid of the unequal treaties, we're going to negotiate new ones. Now, they don't follow through 100%. I want to stress that. The Soviet Union still has some unequal treaties with China. They still will sometimes try and take Chinese territory. But the key thing is, they do renegotiate. They do try and give the Chinese a better deal. Remember, the Americans, we will not give up our unequal treaty rights in China until 1943. And that's mostly because China's our ally in World War II. But here the Soviet Union says, we're getting rid of the unequal treaties. We're getting rid of them. We'll negotiate new ones. China didn't even ask to do that. The Russians, the Soviet Union, offered to do that without being asked. So you got to think about this. You're Chinese. You just had that Versailles Treaty thing where you feel like the liberal democracies of the West just sold you out. And then here the Soviet Union comes in and says, we don't want to be like those people over there who are being hypocrites. We're going to give you a new deal. Now, like I said, it's true they didn't follow through 100%, but they followed through somewhat. And if you're Chinese, you're going to say, maybe there's something to this whole communism thing. Certainly worth me looking into. These communists seem to be behaving differently. They've had a successful revolution. Ours wasn't successful. Remember AQ? Let's try something. And the Soviet Union will send support. And I don't just mean advice, I mean money. They send a lot of money. And they will help organize this new Communist Party. And the Chinese Communist Party will be established in 1921. It will be established in 1921. Like I said, there's a strong interest in communism, and many anarchists convert to communism. That may seem really weird to you, because when we think of communism, we think of big governments, and anarchists, we think of no governments. But theoretically speaking, both anarchists and communists believe that one day there would be no government. Right? So they actually are very similar. So we have this interest in communism, right? Communism seems to get things done. These other ideologies don't. And this gives us Chinese an alternative. So why was communism attractive? It claimed to be both scientific and democratic. Really democratic, not like those Western liberal democracies and not like Japan, which seem to be falsely democratic because of their economic inequality. It also promised that the Chinese could reform. The Chinese aren't doomed. Remember social Darwinism? It's kind of like we're doomed racially. Like maybe we can save ourselves, but we've got a lot of problems. Communism says, nope, nope, nope. You can reform, you can change. Just follow communism. Also, the Soviet Union was there to help bring that reform, to offer practical assistance. Remember, we watched earlier, who did Sun Yat-sen turn to for help? The Soviet Union. No one else was helping the guy. And also, it had a more positive explanation of China's problems. China was an innocent victim. Imperialism was a result of evil capitalists looking for new markets. That's how Vladimir Lenin, the leader of the Russian Revolution, he wrote this fascinating book about imperialism. He said what drives imperialism is the search for new markets, because capitalists overproduce. They're so efficient at production, they overproduce. So he said the Chinese are not bad. You're good, but you're being oppressed by these evil people. And remember social Darwinism. Social Darwinism said if you're being oppressed, it's your fault. Remember social Darwinism, survival of the fittest, that's a scientific law. You're not fit, you don't survive. Why is China suffering? It's the Chinese's fault. They should have been fitter. And it's right that they're being oppressed. Communism says it's the exact opposite. Communism says you're fine, they're the oppressors, not you. Right? It's not your fault. We've got a program that you can follow that will save you. You're not hopeless. Social Darwinism says you're hopeless. We don't think so. Like I said, the Chinese are not bad. These problems were economic and universal. Everyone had these problems. And here's the thing. Imagine this in school. Think of a kid who bullied you in school. Right? There was probably someone who was like a bully to you. And imagine if that kid, not only did they bully you, and say, you know what? If one day you want to beat me, you got to be just like me. That's not fun, is it? That's humiliating. Not only am I getting beaten up by you, I'm being told that I have to be like you. That's exactly what was happening to China. China was being beaten up by all these foreign powers and was told to, if you want to be strong, China, if you want to stop getting beaten up, you got to become like us. Well, here comes the Soviet Union and says, no, you don't. You don't have to become like the oppressors. We've got a new program. And doesn't the Soviet Union seem different? Now, you probably know it doesn't go that well in the Soviet Union, but remember, people at the time don't know that. I says, and this seems like it will work. Didn't it work in Russia? Right? Didn't it work in Russia? So that brings us then, I want to talk briefly about a man named Mao Zedong. Right? Mao Zedong was born into a prosperous peasant family, which is kind of interesting because prosperous peasant families, those are people that they often went after, the communists later, but that's who he was. He was a very curious person. He was a very voracious reader. The guy loved to read, right? The guy loved to read. And not only that, he was actually sent to a modern school, right? He actually got to get a modern education. I think he went through to the equivalent of high school, right? He went through to the equivalent of high school. He will join the Republican Army, right? Remember that the revolutionaries, they have an army. He's going to join it. And he remembered as a soldier, he marched into an area where they tried to launch the revolution too early, and the revolutionaries got slaughtered. And he saw all the dead bodies of the revolutionaries. And he became convinced you can't have a revolution without enough strength. Right? He saw what happened to these failed revolutionaries. He said, I got to be strong. We're playing for keeps. If we launch a revolution and we're not strong enough, we're going to die. Right? So like I said, he had this experience of going into areas where the people had tried to launch the 1911 revolution a little bit too early. And he saw the dead. What's fascinating about this guy, not only was he a revolutionary, he was a poet. Right? Mao Zedong was a very good poet. Right? He knew how to write poetry really well. And what's also really striking to me, a lot of times when you think of poets, no offense if there's poets in here, this is a stereotype, but there's sometimes some truth to it, stereotypes. We don't think of poets as necessarily being the most organized people, right? A lot of times when we think of a creative person, we think of someone who's unorganized. Now, I'm not saying that that's the way it always is, but there's that stereotype. Mao Zedong totally destroys that stereotype because this guy was not only a poet, meaning he was creative and had an amazing imagination, he was an amazing administrator. The guy could organize things unbelievably well. He was an expert organizer. So he combines many different things. And one thing we have to stress, what we've seen so far in China, remember how we looked at the 16 maxims of the Kangxi Emperor? Those things that, remember there was it was 9 characters, there'd be 4 characters, then 1 in order to. So in Chinese poetry and poems and songs, and you would sing Chinese poetry traditionally, it's a learning mechanism. Poetry in China is often about education. And so what's key is, by being a good poet, a lot of times when Western people, we think of poets, we think of things that are really hard to understand. Chinese poetry is not necessarily like that. It's often very simple and easy to understand. It's like a song. So what my point is, he was this brilliant creative person who could communicate those ideas so that simple people could understand them. Right? You know how some people are so smart you can't understand what they're talking about? Mao Zedong was not one of them. So he was a man who was incredibly brilliant, incredibly creative, but able to communicate to lots of different kinds of people, and was extraordinarily well organized. And you can see something of his thought. He wrote an essay on the death of this woman, Miss Chow. I don't have this in the PowerPoint, but I do want to just talk about this briefly to give you an idea of how communism and these kind of scientific ideas are affecting China. Miss Chow was a young lady who was on her way to be married. Right? She was leaving her house to her husband's house, and they carried her in like a palanquin. It's like a box that you can't see inside because it's inappropriate to see the bride before she gets married. So they're carrying her to get married, and when they opened the doors of the palanquin so she could join her new family, she had killed herself. They opened it up and it was her dead body because she didn't want to marry that man. Right? She chose to commit suicide instead. And Mao Zedong responded with an article writing about this, and he says, yesterday's incident was important. It happened because of the shameful system of arranged marriages. Notice he's not talking about something like individual morality. He's talking about systems and social customs. Because of the darkness of the social system, the negation of the individual will, and the absence of freedom to choose one's own mate. It is to be hoped that interested persons will comment on all aspects of this affair, and they will defend the honor of a girl who died a martyr's death for the cause of the freedom to choose her own love. Right, so we're going to use social science to better understand and fix our sick society so we can have freedom. The family, the parents, and the family, the future husband are both bound up with society. They're both parts of society. We must understand the family, the parents, and the family, the future husband have committed a crime. But the source of the crime lies in society. Very sociological thinking, right? It is true the two families themselves carried out this crime, but a great part of the culpability was transmitted to them by society. Moreover, society were good. Even if the families had wanted to carry out this crime, they would not have had the opportunity to do so. Right, so we can kind of see how Chinese thought is developing in a more sociological aspect. He's not communist yet, but communism will make a lot of sense if you're already thinking this way. We'll stop there. I'll see you all on Friday. And we didn't quite get to section 7 as I hoped. Hopefully we will. We definitely will on Wednesday.
That's definitely interesting. I never would believe I would agree with Mao on no arranged marriage.
Sure. Well, Mao's later love life, he was a bit of a philanderer, or a lot of a philanderer. So, yeah, he starts off as kind of feminist. He doesn't end as one.